Be looking for work," my father said, lifting his glass just high enough for everyone at the table to hear. He wasn't angry, and he wasn't joking. He was simply certain. It was the kind of certainty that assumes you have already failed, and that everyone else in the room agrees with that assessment. This was his villa dinner, filled with his guests and his business partners, people whose opinions shaped entire careers. I was present only because he had texted me earlier that day saying, "Be here tonight. Important partners. Family should show unity." So I came. I didn't attend because I wanted to, but because I had long ago learned my role in these social maneuvers, fill the chair, and complete the family portrait. No one corrected him, and no one looked at me. The conversation barely slowed down. I felt that familiar heat rising in my chest, not quite rage, but the dull burn of knowing I was present, yet not truly counted. I was debating whether to swallow the insult as I always did, or finally speak up when I heard the scrape of a chair. His boss stood up. He didn't look at my father. He looked directly at me. He smiled not with kindness or politeness, but like a man who already knew exactly how this story ended. That was the moment my father stopped speaking. The silence that followed was sharp and precise. It wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. It was the kind of quiet that makes people suddenly uncomfortably aware of their own breathing. My father's hand froze mid-gesture, his wine glass suspended in the air like an unfinished sentence. I had been in moments like this before, not this exact one, but close enough to recognize the pattern. There were the holiday dinners where my brother was showered with congratulations on his latest promotion, while I was asked careful questions about whether I was still doing that computer thing. There were the Sunday brunches where my mother would casually mention a friend's child who had a real job in finance. There were the birthdays where my father introduced everyone else with their full titles and then gestured vaguely in my direction, saying, "And this is Victoria." Richard Whitmore had spent 32 years at Meridian Capital. To him, success was strictly measurable titles, square footage, and properties like the villa where we were currently sitting. He believed deeply that he understood the inner workings of the world. In his model, there were builders and there were employees. He had never once considered which side of that line his daughter might be on. My mother was a master of social redirection. Whenever tension rose, she smoothed it over, changed the subject, and kept things pleasant. I could see her calculating her next move, deciding whether or not to interrupt. She remained silent. My brother, sitting 3 seats down, wore a look I knew well, the one that said, "Poor Victoria, she means well." He was already preparing to speak, likely to make a joke that would gently put me back in the box where everyone expected me to stay. William Crawford spoke first. "Richard," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the kind of natural authority that never needs volume. "I think there's been a misunderstanding at this table. Since we're among colleagues, I'd like to clear it up." My father set his glass down with exaggerated care. I recognized that movement. It was the gesture of a man who sensed his control was slipping, but hadn't yet figured out why. "William, I apologize if Victoria has done something." "Done something," William repeated lightly. "That is an interesting choice of words." He turned to address the table. "How many of you have heard of Vertex Holdings?" Several hands went up immediately. I saw a flash of recognition cross my father's face. Vertex Holdings was the very company Meridian had been pursuing for months, an enterprise software firm that had disrupted multiple markets with ownership strategically buried under layers of LLCs. Vertex Holdings has agreed to a strategic partnership with Meridian Capital. William continued. "It will be announced next week. It represents the largest technology investment in our firm's history." He paused for effect. "And the founder is sitting at this table." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Attention rearranged itself. My father shook his head slightly, like a man trying to reject information that didn't fit his reality. "That's not Victoria," Williams said, looking directly at me. "Would you like to tell them, or should I?" This wasn't at all how I had imagined this moment. If the truth ever came out, I thought it would be on my own terms in a boardroom surrounded by lawyers. I didn't want it here like this. But some moments do not wait for permission. "Vertex Holdings is mine," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "I founded it 6 years ago. I own 83%. The current valuation is approximately $1.2 billion pre-money. The numbers landed heavily. I saw confusion on some faces and flat disbelief on others. On my father's face, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine shock. "That's impossible," my brother stammered. "Victoria works from home. She does freelance work." "She runs a company with 400 employees and 3 Fortune 100 clients," William countered. "I've seen the financials. They are exceptional." My mother had gone pale, staring at me as if she were seeing a complete stranger. "Why, my father?" asked, his voice sounding rough. "Why would you hide this?" I had asked myself that question many times over the years. Part of it was protection. I wanted to build something that wasn't attached to the Whitmore name. Part of it was sheer exhaustion. Explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was felt entirely pointless. But the simplest answer was the truth no one had ever really asked. "You didn't want to know," I said. "You wanted me to be the example of what not to do." William cleared his throat, shifting the room back into professional mode and excusing the guests. They exited quickly. When the villa was finally quiet, my father looked smaller, less certain. He hadn't just missed out on a business deal, he had missed the possibility that I could be on the other side of it. "I'm going home," I said, picking up my bag. "We can talk later." Or not. I walked out into the night without looking back. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. The truth was out, and it would do its own work. The following morning, I woke up to 47 text messages, 12 missed calls, and 1 email that actually mattered. It was from William Crawford's executive assistant. The subject line read, "Partnership documents urgent." I ignored the messages from my family and opened that email first. Attached was the partnership agreement on Meridian capital letterhead, standard clean and familiar. At the bottom, however, there was a short, scanned, handwritten note. "Victoria, my office, 2 p.m., alone. W.C. I showered, got dressed, and chose clothes my family had never seen me wear. The kind of clothes you buy once you no longer feel the need to explain your existence." I then drove downtown. The Meridian Capitol building was a glass tower in the financial district designed to make visitors feel small the moment they stepped inside. I had been there twice before, both times slipping through side entrances with my head down to avoid anyone who might recognize my last name. This time I walked straight through the front door. The receptionist looked up when I gave my name. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by immediate professionalism. "Ms. Whitmore, Mr. Crawford is expecting you." She called upstairs and pointed toward the elevators. 42nd floor. The ride-up felt longer than it should have. When the doors opened, a woman in a gray suit was waiting for me. "This way, please." William's office was exactly what one would expect: floor-to-ceiling Windows furniture that didn't need a logo to prove its cost, and a desk that was almost completely empty. He stood when I entered and gestured to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming. Your note said it was urgent." "It is." He folded his hands. "I've worked with your father for 15 years. I know how he operates. I've watched him dismiss you at company events and heard him talk about you like you were a disappointment he didn't want to acknowledge out loud." He paused. "Last night wasn't an accident." I nodded. "You knew before the dinner." "For 8 months," he admitted. "When Vertex first crossed my desk, the ownership structure raised flags. It took time to trace it back. When your name finally appeared, I'll admit I was surprised." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because the deal mattered more than the reveal," he said, "and because I wanted to see how Richard would react when the truth arrived without warning." He leaned forward. "Your father has been angling for a board seat for years. Last night's dinner was supposed to be his moment, his network and his investors all watching him play the perfect host. Instead, they watched him dismiss the founder of the most valuable partnership Meridian has signed in a decade. I let that settle in. So you used me to damage him." William shook his head slightly. "I used the truth. What it damaged was his illusion of control." There was no emotion in his voice, only calculation, the same kind of calculation I'd learned to use myself. "The partnership," I asked, "is it still happening?" "That depends on you." He slid a folder across the desk. The terms were unchanged, favorable, clean, and exactly what we'd negotiated for months. But the environment surrounding the deal had shifted. My father worked here. His reputation was now tied to mine, whether either of us liked it or not. "What happens to my father?" I asked. William didn't hesitate. Richard's standing here has always been built on perceived judgment. If that judgment is now questioned, that is not something I can undo. But you could soften the blow. I could, he said. But I won't. He walked over to the window. 12 senior investors watched your father reduce you to a failure. By this morning, 8 of them had already called me asking about Vertex. About you. The market corrects itself, Victoria. I didn't create that correction. I just didn't stop it. I signed the documents. When I left the building, my phone was filled with more messages from Marcus. My mother and my father, all of them asking for control back. I deleted them without reading. Instead, I called Jennifer, my CFO. The Meridian deal is signed. Prepare the team for the announcement. She paused. You sound different. I am, I said. I ended the call and stood on the sidewalk watching people move past me, each wrapped in their own urgency. Somewhere in this city, my father was sitting in an office that suddenly felt far less permanent. My mother was likely already rewriting the family narrative for her friends. Marcus was probably calculating new angles. For the first time, none of it mattered. The deal was done. The truth was out. Whatever happened next would occur on terms that I controlled. My phone buzzed again. It was an unknown number. Victoria Whitmore. This is Business Insider. We'd love to talk about Vertex Holdings. Is now a good time? I turned my phone off and walked toward my car. The press would come. That was inevitable. But when they did, it would be because I allowed it. The power had shifted, and I wasn't giving it back. 3 days after the dinner at the villa, I received a calendar invite from my father's executive assistant. The subject line read, Family Discussion, Private Dining Room, The Wellington Club. 7 p.m. There was no greeting and no explanation, just the assumption that I would show up. The Wellington Club was my father's home turf, dark wood leather chairs, and membership fees designed to keep the wrong people out. He had chosen it on purpose. Familiar ground. His rules. I arrived 15 minutes early. The private dining room was empty except for a server setting 4 places. I chose the chair facing the door. It was a small detail, but I knew my father always noticed positioning. Marcus arrived first. He paused when he saw me, then slipped easily into his practiced smile. Vicky, you look different. He sat down across from me, his eyes scanning everything. My clothes, my watch, my posture as if he were reviewing a legal document for potential risk. The suit, the watch. I guess you've been hiding more than just a company. I haven't been hiding, I said. You just never bothered to look. Before he could reply, our parents walked in. My mother's eyes were red, though her makeup was carefully done to suggest she hadn't been crying. My father looked heavier than usual, not older, just burdened. He took the head seat out of habit. Victoria, he said, his voice measured and professional. It was the voice he used in high-stakes negotiations. We need to talk about what happened. Which part? His jaw tightened. Don't play games. You've lied to this family for 6 years. You humiliated me in front of colleagues I've worked with for decades. I didn't lie, I said calmly. I never told you I was unsuccessful. You simply decided that I was. I never said I was struggling. You filled in the gaps yourselves. Every version of me you believed in was your story, not mine. My mother reached across the table. Sweetheart, we just want to understand. Understand what I asked, why I built something successful, or why I didn't tell you I looked at all 3 of them. How many times did any of you actually ask me about my work? I don't mean jokes or concern disguised as advice. How many real questions did you ask? No one answered. Exactly. My father exhaled sharply. This isn't about us. This is about your deception. This is entirely about you, I said, leaning forward. I kept my name off the company because I knew the moment you found out, you'd try to make it yours. You'd brag about it, offer unsolicited advice, and turn my hard work into a reflection of your own ego. That's not fair. It's precise. I stood up. I'm not here to apologize. I came because Mom asked, and because I thought maybe this time you'd actually want to listen. But if this is just another attempt to tell me how I embarrassed you, then we're finished. My father stood as well, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Sit down. You don't get to walk away. I do, I said. I'm not a child anymore. You don't get to summon me and decide the outcome. "Richard," my mother said sharply. "Enough." He ignored her. "I've spent 30 years building my reputation, and in one night nothing was destroyed," I said, shouldering my bag. "Your reputation is built on people believing you see what others don't. What happened merely exposed the truth that you never bothered to look." I was at the door when Marcus finally spoke. "The Meridian Partnership," he said. "Dad has to recuse himself, right?" I turned back. Marcus wasn't upset. He was calculating. "Ask compliance," I said. "I'm asking you." "Then yes," I replied. Vertex Holdings is now a conflict of interest. That means the biggest deal Meridian has ever signed is one Dad can't touch. He can't leverage it or use it for his board ambitions. Marcus glanced at our father. Something cracked in his expression. Not anger, but something much colder. "That's convenient," he said. "It's a consequence," I replied. I opened the door. I didn't plan for any of this. William Crawford did. But I'm not sorry about the result. I stepped into the evening air. Behind me, voices rose, my father's, my mother's attempts to calm him, and Marcus saying something low and urgent. My phone buzzed with an email from Jennifer board meeting tomorrow at 9. Crawford's team will be there. Also something odd with David Palmer. Expense reports. Access patterns. Might be nothing. Want me to flag it? David Palmer was the head of business development, smart, efficient, and always a little too well-informed. "Flag it," I typed back. "Pull his access logs. Don't alert him." I put my phone away and hailed a cab. Behind me, the Wellington Club glowed warmly, as if nothing had changed. Inside, however, my family was still unraveling. But the pattern was broken. The conversation was over. Tomorrow, while they were still trying to regain control, I would be in a boardroom, making sure the shift became permanent. The Vertex Holdings boardroom occupied the entire 28th floor of a building I owned through 3 separate holding companies. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space overlooking the city, from every angle, the kind of view meant to signal control scale and permanence. The table could seat 20 executives comfortably. Today, only 6 chairs were filled, me, Jennifer, 2 lawyers, and William Crawford, with his senior partner. The room felt quieter than usual, not tense, but precise. It was the kind of quiet that meant decisions were about to become permanent. "Before we begin," William said, folding his hands on the table, "I should inform you that Richard Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave, pending a compliance review." I set my pen down carefully. That was fast. 3 of our largest institutional investors contacted the board yesterday. William replied, his tone remaining neutral. They expressed concerns about Mr. Whitmore's judgment. Concerns. A polite corporate word for alarm. The Vertex partnership represents a significant portion of our technology portfolio going forward, he continued. Having a senior executive with an undisclosed family connection to the founder creates perception issues. Undisclosed because he didn't know, I pointed out. Undisclosed, regardless of the reason, William replied without hesitation. He slid a document across the table. "This is the final partnership agreement. Page 17 addresses potential conflicts of interest. Your legal team should review the language carefully." I flipped to page 17 while my lawyers leaned in their pens, already moving. The provisions were standard but thorough disclosure requirements, mandatory recusals and safeguards, layered carefully enough to withstand any scrutiny. Any future dealings between Meridian and Vertex would require absolute transparency. Any executive with a family connection to either party would be removed from decision-making immediately. "This effectively removes my father from any involvement with your technology practice," I said. "It removes him from involvement with this partnership specifically," William corrected. "What happens to his broader role is a matter for Meridian's board. We signed the documents." The ink dried, the lawyers witnessed, and hands were shaken. When William's team left, Jennifer stood and quietly closed the conference room door. "I pulled David Palmer's access logs," she said, and she set her laptop on the table and turned it toward me. "Over the past 6 weeks, David has accessed files related to our investor relations strategy, our cap table, and our upcoming IPO timeline." She paused. "None of these files are relevant to his business development role." I leaned forward, scanning the timestamps, late nights, weekends, and odd hours. These were times when David had no legitimate reason to be anywhere near that data. "There's more," Jennifer said. She pulled up another screen. His expense reports show recurring meetings at the same restaurant in Midtown, every Thursday. Same table, same time, for the past 2 months. She hesitated before adding, "I cross-referenced the reservation records. The name on the bookings was Whitmore, my father." I sat back and let the information settle. The pieces arranged themselves quietly in my mind, clicking into place one by one. David Palmer had been meeting with my father regularly and privately while accessing Vertex's most sensitive strategic information. "How did they connect?" I asked. "I don't know yet," Jennifer said, "but I have a theory." She pulled up David's LinkedIn profile. Before joining Vertex, David worked at Harrington Associates. I didn't need her to finish the sentence. "My father sits on Harrington's advisory board," I said. The chessboard cleared. My father hadn't learned about Vertex at the dinner by chance. He might not have known I was the founder yet, but he'd been gathering intelligence for weeks, maybe months. Jennifer looked at me. "What do you want to do?" The old version of me would have hesitated. That version would have confronted David, quietly asked for explanations, and tried to contain the damage to avoid a scandal. That version had walked out of the Wellington Club last night. "Lock his access immediately," I said. "Every system, every file, every building. Change any security codes he knows." Jennifer typed quickly. "Have legal preparation termination documents for cause." I continued. "I want every breach of his employment agreement itemized." She nodded. "And pull any emails between his personal devices and external addresses. If he's been forwarding information, I want to know exactly to whom." "That could take a few days," she said. "We have time," I replied. "He doesn't know we're looking yet." I walked to the window. Somewhere out there, my father was probably sitting in his home office, suspended from the job he'd spent 3 decades building, waiting for news from his inside man. He was waiting to find out whether I was vulnerable or if there was an angle left to exploit. He didn't understand yet that the game had changed. He didn't realize that I wasn't the daughter he thought he knew, hiding success out of fear or shame. I was someone who had learned to anticipate attacks from those closest to her, because sometimes the people closest to you are the most dangerous. My phone rang. It was Marcus. I let it go to voicemail and then listened. "Vicky, it's me," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "I know things are complicated, but I think we should talk. Just the two of us. I'm not Dad. I'm not going to lecture you. I just want to understand what's happening." I deleted the message and turned back to Jennifer. "One more thing. If anyone from my family contacts anyone at this company, anyone at all, I want to know immediately." She looked up. "You think they'll try something?" "I think my father is used to controlling information," I said, "and I think he doesn't realize yet how much control he's already lost." Outside, the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the city in gold and red. Millions of people moved through their lives below, unaware that in this quiet boardroom, alliances were shifting and assumptions were collapsing. I had built Vertex Holdings to be entirely my own, no family name, no inherited power, no expectations. But building in secret only delays the inevitable. Eventually, everything hidden comes to light. And when it does, you learn exactly who your allies are. My father had sent someone to spy on me. Now I was going to find out just how far that betrayal went. The documents arrived on a Tuesday morning in a manila envelope hand-delivered by a courier. A signature was required and my photo ID was checked. No explanation was given. That alone told me this wasn't routine. Inside were 3 months of emails, meeting transcripts, and internal financial projections, every page stamped with Vertex Holdings' confidential watermark. It was the kind reserved for board circulation only, which no one outside a very small circle should ever see. David Palmer had been thorough. He hadn't been reckless or careless. He had been thorough. I spread the papers across my desk and began tracing the timeline from the beginning. What stood out immediately wasn't theft. It was patience. It started innocuously with casual questions at industry events and light conversation framed as professional curiosity. There were networking introductions that felt coincidental at the time, harmless enough to forget. They weren't coincidental. My father had been cultivating David for almost a year before David ever applied to Vertex. The job application itself had been engineered a chance meeting with our head of HR at a conference and a glowing recommendation from a mutual colleague my father trusted. Even the salary negotiation had been calculated slightly below market and cooperative enough to look reasonable instead of ambitious. An easy yes. Once inside, David didn't rush. He delivered results, hit targets, and built credibility. He waited. Slowly and deliberately, he gained access. He didn't get everything just enough to matter. The emails between him and my father were careful, clean, and professional. There was no emotion and no language that could be read as personal. My father was never named. He was the client. I was the subject. Vertex Holdings was the target. The subject shows no awareness of surveillance. The target's IPO timeline appears to be Q3. Board composition suggests vulnerability to activist pressure. This wasn't curiosity. It was preparation. My father hadn't been trying to understand what I built. He'd been building a dossier. Jennifer knocked on my office door. Legal is ready. The termination took less than 10 minutes. David sat in the conference room flanked by our head of HR and 2 security officers. At first he looked confused. He had the confidence of someone who believed this was a misunderstanding that could be explained away. Then I placed the printed emails in front of him. I watched his face change from confusion to anger, then denial, and finally a cold understanding. These communications were obtained through standard internal security protocols, I said, my voice remaining even. Your employment agreement includes confidentiality and conflict of interest provisions. You violated both. Victoria, if you'll just let me explain. There's nothing to explain, I said. You were hired to spy on me. You've been transmitting confidential company information to an external party for over a year. The only remaining question is whether we pursue this criminally. His face drained of color. Criminal charges. Corporate espionage is a felony in this state, I said. Our lawyers have already drafted a complaint. Your father will. My father is currently on administrative leave from Meridian Capital, I said, gathering the documents. He is pending an investigation into his own conduct. Whatever protection you thought he could offer no longer exists. David was escorted out through the service entrance. From my office window, I watched him step onto the sidewalk below, carrying a cardboard box. He stopped and looked up at the building as if it had betrayed him. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. It was my father. I answered. Victoria. His voice was strained and only barely controlled. My attorney just called. He says Vertex Holdings is threatening criminal charges against an employee who was feeding you confidential information about my company, I finished. Yes. There was silence. This doesn't have to be public, he said finally. We can settle this privately. Family business. Family business. I let the phrase sit between us. Is that what you call planting a spy in your daughter's company, spending a year building a file on her? Looking for ways to what exactly, Dad? What was the plan? More silence. I was trying to understand what you built, he said. You wouldn't tell us anything, so you committed corporate espionage. I wanted to protect you, he said, his voice rising. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Private equity and institutional investors will eat you alive if you're not careful. I was trying to help, by gathering intelligence you could use against me. I laughed once without humor. By looking for vulnerabilities in my company. You weren't protecting me. You were trying to control me. You always have been. When you couldn't control me directly, you went around me. Victoria. The charges against David Palmer will move forward, I said. Your involvement will be documented. If I find out you traded on any non-public information or shared it with anyone who did this becomes a federal matter. The SEC is very clear about that. I heard his breath catch. In 30 years of corporate warfare, Richard Whitmore had never been on the receiving end of such a threat. You would do that to your own father? You did this to your own daughter. I hung up. The next call I made was to William Crawford. I need to inform you of a development that may affect Meridian's position. I told him everything David Palmer, the access, the emails, and my father's role. He didn't interrupt. This will need to go to our board, he said finally. I understand. Victoria. His tone shifted. Your father's administrative leave is about to become permanent. This information will accelerate that timeline. I know. Are you prepared for that? I looked out my window at the city below. Somewhere out there, my father was sitting in a house he'd bought with a career that was about to end. My mother was probably pacing and making phone calls, trying to understand how everything had collapsed so quickly. I've been preparing for years, I said. I just didn't know it until now. After we hung up, I opened the full file Jennifer had compiled, every email, every access log, and every step my father had taken to maintain his illusion of control. The papers will be filed tomorrow. Within a week, the story would be public. Richard Whitmore, senior executive respected dealmaker and pillar of the financial community, would be known as the man who committed espionage against his own daughter. There was no way back from this. For the first time since all of this began, I felt nothing at all. The Whitmore family counteroffensive began on Thursday. It didn't start with lawyers or threats. It started the way it always had with my mother. Her name lit up my phone mid-morning. I already knew what she was going to say before I answered. "Victoria, please," she said, her voice soft and careful. It was the voice she used when she wanted something without admitting it. "Can we just talk as a family? Your father is devastated. There has to be a way to work this out. There always had to be a way, so long as I was the one expected to bend." "I'm not available," I said. There was a pause and a small intake of breath. "You don't mean that?" "I do." I ended the call before she could say anything else. An hour later, Marcus tried a different approach. He showed up at my office without warning, just as he had done 100 times while we were growing up. No appointment, no request, just entitlement disguised as familiarity. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, wearing concern like a tailored suit. "I'm not here to defend Dad," he said smoothly. What he did was wrong. I get that. But going public with criminal charges, that's extreme. It's going to destroy him. It's going to tear this family apart. Our family fell apart a long time ago. "Marcus," I said, "I just stopped pretending it hadn't." For a moment, his mask slipped. Then he leaned forward, his voice lowering. "This is about revenge, isn't it? All those years of being overlooked. All the dinners, the jokes, and the way Dad treated you. Now you finally have the power to hurt him back." If I wanted revenge, I said I would have leaked everything to the press myself. Instead, I followed legal process. The fact that the process exposes Dad's behavior isn't spite. It's a consequence. Same outcome, he said. "Different intent," I replied, "and intent matters." I stood up. "I have a meeting. Security will walk you out." His expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Vicky. Dad still has friends. Powerful friends. You don't want to be on the wrong side of... Is that a threat?" He straightened his tie, slipping back into control. "It's a reality check. You've won a battle. Don't assume you've won the war." After he left, I didn't sit down. I called Jennifer immediately. Increase security protocols, personal and corporate, and run background checks on anyone who's contacted my assistant in the last 2 weeks. She didn't ask why. The family's next move came through lawyers. My father's attorneys sent a letter demanding we drop all charges against David Palmer in exchange for a confidential settlement. The amount was substantial, life-changing for most people. It was the kind of number meant to make problems disappear. I had my lawyers respond with one sentence: "Our client declines your offer and intends to pursue all available legal remedies." The following Monday, the narrative shifted. An article appeared in a financial trade publication, Family Feud or Corporate Warfare Inside the Vertex Holdings Scandal. Someone had leaked the story. It didn't deny the espionage, it reframed it. I was described as unstable, vindictive, and unable to maintain relationships. An anonymous family source painted me as a bitter daughter who had hidden her success out of spite and was now using her company to punish the people who had always supported her. Jennifer brought me the article. "Your father's PR firm," she said. "They're pushing this narrative everywhere. It was clever, make the crime secondary and make me the problem." "Call Margaret Cole," I said. By Wednesday, I was sitting under studio lights across from a host who looked like she could have been my mother's friend. "Some people say this has become personal," she said, "that you're pursuing legal action against your own father out of spite rather than legitimate business concerns." I smiled. "Can I show you something?" The screen filled with a timeline, David Palmer's employment access logs, meeting records, and emails, all verified, time-stamped, and documented. "This isn't personal," I said. "It's factual." Over 18 months, an employee betrayed his company at the direction of someone with a financial interest in undermining it. The fact that that person is my father doesn't change the nature of the crime. It just makes it more painful. The host leaned in. "Your father says he was trying to protect you, to understand a daughter who had shut him out. If my father wanted to understand me, he could have asked," I said. "In 6 years of building this company, he never asked a single question about what I was doing or why. Instead, he hired someone to spy on me." I paused. "That's not protection. That's control. When you spend decades believing you have the right to control something, losing that control can make you do desperate things." The interview aired that night. By morning, the tone had shifted. The press stopped asking if this was personal and started asking whether Richard Whitmore should have been trusted in the first place, about his judgment, his ethics, and his fitness for leadership. On Friday, Meridian Capital announced his termination. There was no ceremony, no transition role, and no face-saving narrative, just a brief statement thanking him for his years of service. It was over. I was in a car heading to a dinner meeting when my mother called again. I let it go to voicemail. "Victoria," she said, her voice breaking, "your father's in the hospital, chest pains. The doctors say it's stress-related. Whatever you think of us, whatever we've done wrong, he's still your father. Please, please call me." I stared at my phone for a long moment, then put it away and told the driver to continue. Some doors once closed do not reopen. My father had spent years making sure I knew I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to belong in his world. Now that world was collapsing and he was looking for someone to stop the fall. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had built something of my own, something he couldn't touch, claim, or control. If watching it succeed while his life unraveled was painful, that too was a consequence. My father spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors called it stress-induced arrhythmia, not a collapse but a warning. His body was doing what his mind refused to do, admit that the empire he built was decaying and that no amount of barking orders could force it back into shape. I didn't visit him. My mother called every hour, and Marcus sent messages that grew shorter and sharper as the days passed. "The family needs to come together. This has gone too far. Dad could die." I read them, deleted them, and looked back at my monitors. In my world, reality still followed rules. If you break the law, you pay the price. It was that simple. The Vertex Holdings IPO accelerated faster than our most aggressive models had predicted. Ironically, the family scandal was the best marketing we ever had. In the cutthroat circles of high finance, I wasn't seen as a traitor. I was a legend, the woman who built a billion-dollar firm in the dark and outplayed a giant. On the 4th day, William Crawford called. "I thought you should know," he said. "Richard has retained new counsel. They're preparing a defamation suit. Against who? You, Vertex, Meridian Capital." Every trade publication ran the story. I didn't laugh, but I felt a cold sense of predictability. My father, staring at the wreckage of his reputation, was doing the only thing he knew, attacking, instead of accepting the consequence. "Our legal team is already moving." William continued. "The evidence against David Palmer is ironclad. Any lawsuit your father files would trigger discovery." Discovery. That was the magic word. It meant a deep dive into decades of his private records, emails, back-channel deals, and shady arrangements that had never seen the light of day. "I suspect his lawyers will explain that to him," William added dryly, "right after they cash his retainer check." The lawsuit was filed on Tuesday and withdrawn by Thursday. The reason was obvious. My father realized that if he opened that door, the SEC wouldn't just be looking at his role in Vertex. They'd be looking at his entire life. A brief blurb appeared in the news. "Richard Whitmore drops lawsuit cites. Family reconciliation." It was a total lie, but at this stage, fiction was the only currency he had left. 2 months later, my mother showed up at my office without an appointment. She walked past my assistant and opened my door with the same entitlement she used to enter a country club. "I'm not leaving until you talk to me," she said. She looked thinner. The expensive polish she'd maintained for decades was starting to peel. She wasn't just older, she looked defeated. I waved off security and gave her 5 minutes. "Your father's been diagnosed with depression," she said, her hands trembling. "He barely leaves the house. The doctors are worried." She paused, looking for a crack in my expression. "I'm not asking you to forgive him, but you're his daughter. That has to mean something." "Does it?" I asked. Her voice cracked. "After everything we gave you, everything we sacrificed, what exactly did you sacrifice?" I kept my voice flat and professional. "I went to the schools you chose. I had opportunities because of your name. But I built this company while you told me every single day that I would never be enough. Every joke at my expense, every comparison to Marcus, every time you asked when I'd get a real job. That was your story, not mine." I leaned forward, looking her straight in the eye. "I hid my success because I knew you'd try to claim it. You'd turn my hard work into a reflection of your parenting. You didn't love me, Mom. You loved the version of me you could control." She was crying now, but I didn't reach for the tissues. "He committed a crime," I said. "He hired a spy. That's not fear, that's ego." I stood up. "Your 5 minutes are up." She didn't move. "What do you want from us?" "An apology. A statement. Please, don't let the family end like this." I opened the door. My security guard was already standing there. "The family ended years ago," I said. "I just stopped pretending it existed." I watched her leave, then stood by the window. Somewhere out there, my father was sitting in a darkened room, unable to understand how he'd lost his grip on the world. My mother was likely already calling Marcus to plan their next move, but there was nothing left to break, only the truth. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. "IPO Roadshow starts Monday. Final prep at 10. I looked at the city lights one last time, then turned away. There was work to do. The IPO Roadshow took us to 12 cities in 18 days: San Francisco, New York, Boston, Chicago, London, Hong Kong. Airports blurred together, and hotel rooms started to look the same. Every morning followed the same rhythm: an early wake-up black coffee, a tailored suit, and a car waiting downstairs. Every afternoon was filled with numbers charts and projections. Every night consisted of dinners with people who measured worth in decimals and growth curves. By the end of the second week, I could deliver the Vertex Holdings pitch without thinking revenue streams, market penetration, risk mitigation, long-term vision. I knew exactly where to pause, where to emphasize, and when to let silence do the work. Investors nodded at the right moments, and analysts scribbled notes. The machine was working exactly as designed. It was in Chicago that everything cracked. We were in a glass-walled conference room at one of the major investment banks, halfway through a Q&A session. Someone was asking about regulatory exposure in international markets when my phone vibrated on the table. Jennifer caught my eye from across the room. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply turned her phone slightly so I could see the screen. Breaking news. Richard Whitmore hospitalized after a critical incident. For a fraction of a second, the room tilted. I didn't react outwardly. Years of discipline took over. I finished answering the question, clarified a margin assumption, and smiled when appropriate. I shook hands when the meeting wrapped and thanked everyone for their time. Only when the doors closed behind me did I step into the hallway and finally exhale. I called Jennifer. "What do we know?" She chose her words carefully. "Your mother found him this morning. Emergency services responded. Doctors say he's stable." She paused. "The press is already linking it to Vertex. Headlines are forming." I leaned my shoulder against the wall, the cool glass grounding me. Somewhere behind me, business continued as usual. Voices, laughter, and deals being discussed. "Cancel my remaining meetings today," I said. "I'm flying back tonight." There was a brief hesitation. "Victoria, the media is already outside the hospital. If you show up, I know I said, but some things can't be delegated. The flight back was 6 hours. I didn't work, read, or sleep." I stared out the window at layers of cloud and dark sky, replaying years in my head. Had I pushed him there? The question circled relentlessly. If I'd stayed quiet, if I'd softened the consequences, or if I'd let him save face, would this still have happened? Or had the fracture always been there, hidden under decades of certainty, authority, and control, just waiting for the moment when the illusion finally collapsed? The hospital sat on the edge of the city, private and discreet. Security kept reporters at a distance, though cameras flashed anyway. I showed my ID and was directed to the 3rd floor. My mother stood in the hallway with her arms crossed tightly around herself. When she saw me, something crossed her face. Relief, hope, desperation. Maybe all three. "He's awake," she said quickly. "Stable. He keeps asking if you've called." I nodded and walked past her. My father lay in the hospital bed surrounded by quiet machines, their steady sounds marking time. He looked smaller than I remembered and less solid. The man who had once dominated rooms now seemed to occupy only the space he absolutely needed. His eyes opened when I stepped inside. "You came." "I did. I didn't think you would." "Neither did I." I pulled a chair closer and sat down. "I didn't know how to stop it," he said after a moment. "The noise, the pressure, the knowing." His voice wavered. "I built my whole life on being right, on being in control. And suddenly, none of it mattered." "That's not why I'm here," I said. He turned his head slightly, then why I took my time answering. "Because the point was never destruction," I said. "The point was truth. And truth doesn't disappear just because it's uncomfortable. Showing up now is part of not pretending anymore." "Does that mean you forgive me?" "No," I said immediately. "I can't forgive what you did. Not yet. You didn't just hurt me. You planned, you controlled, and you crossed lines. I was trying to understand. You were trying to contain," I said quietly. "There's a difference." Silence filled the room. "What happens now?" he asked. "You get help," I said. "Real help. Not image management and not pretending everything's fine. And you accept that the life you built is over." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't know who I am without it. I know I said." "That's the work." I stood up. "The IPO is next week," I said. "After that, if you're willing to do therapy and have honest conversations with no manipulation, then maybe we can talk. But only if it's real." "Victoria," he said softly. "I'm sorry." I turned back. "I know I said. But sorry isn't enough. You have to become someone who wouldn't have done it." I left the room. My mother was still in the hallway looking at me like someone who had just watched something irreversible unfold. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't do it for him," I replied. "I did it because it was right." "Will you come back?" "I don't know," I said. "I won't pretend anymore. Whatever happens has to be real." I walked out as the sun rose. Cameras flashed and questions were shouted, but I didn't answer. The IPO was in 6 days. There was still work to do, but something had shifted. Not forgiveness or peace, but acceptance. I understood that truth doesn't always heal, but it does end the lies. Sometimes the hardest part isn't the fight, it's living with what comes after. The IPO went live on a Tuesday morning. I stood on the trading floor of the stock exchange just before the opening bell, surrounded by Jennifer and the senior leadership team. Screens wrapped around the room glowing with numbers that shifted faster than the eye could track. Traders moved with practiced urgency, their voices overlapping and hands signaling the air charged with motion and noise. When the bell rang, it didn't sound dramatic. It was sharp, clean, and final. Vertex Holdings appeared on the board. The opening price was higher than projected, not by a little, but by enough that I felt it register physically a tightness in my chest I hadn't expected. By mid-morning, volume surged. By noon, we had exceeded every analyst forecast. Jennifer leaned toward me and spoke quietly. "We're outperforming across every metric." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the screen. Years of work were translating into numbers in real-time numbers that now belonged to the public. The cameras were everywhere. News crews lined the edges of the floor with their lenses trained on me. This wasn't just a financial event anymore. It was a story, a family drama layered onto a business success. It was the story of a daughter who had built an empire quietly, and a father who had tried to control it and failed. I gave interviews answering questions about growth strategy, governance, and long-term vision. I smiled when required, shook hands, and posed for photographs in front of the ticker tape backdrop. I performed successfully. But my mind kept drifting. 2 days earlier, William Crawford had called. Richard Whitmore is officially under SEC investigation, he'd said without preamble. I hadn't asked why. I already knew. The information David Palmer had stolen IPO timelines, confidential investor communications, and internal projections had been shared with 3 individuals. Those individuals had traded. It was poorly concealed and enough to raise flags. My father hadn't made the trades himself. He was too careful and too experienced. But control breeds confidence, and confidence breeds carelessness, just not always in the same person. When they started pulling threads, William continued, they all led back to him. How long, I'd asked. Months, possibly longer. But the outcome isn't in doubt. I thanked him, ended the call, and went straight back into IPO prep mode. Now watching Vertex's valuation climb into territory that once felt abstract, I felt something unexpected distance. A journalist approached me mid-afternoon. Ms. Whitmore reports indicate your father is facing federal investigation. Any comments I turned to her, my expression calm. Today is about Vertex Holdings and our investors. Questions about my father should be directed to his legal counsel. Do you feel any responsibility for what's happening to him? I held her gaze. My responsibility is to this company and the people who helped build it. My father made his own choices. The consequences of those choices are his to face. She nodded, scribbled in her notebook, and stepped aside. Another journalist took her place, and then another. By market close, it was official. Vertex Holdings was now publicly traded, and I was officially a billionaire. That evening, I sat alone in my office. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, with light stretching in every direction and traffic pulsing like a living thing. The world kept moving, indifferent to milestones. My phone buzzed constantly with congratulations invitations and messages from people who suddenly remembered knowing me. One message stood out from Marcus. Congratulations on the IPO. I hope it brings you what you're looking for. If you ever want to talk, really talk, I'm here. I stared at it for a moment and then deleted it. There was nothing left to say to Marcus. His concern was strategic, not emotional. He had learned too well from our father a line with power, leverage proximity, and stay relevant. The door opened softly, and Jennifer stepped in with her jacket draped over her arm. Final numbers are in, she said. We exceeded every target. The board is ecstatic. Good. She studied me. You don't seem happy. I am. I'm just tired. That's not what I mean. She sat across from me. I've seen you angry, focused, and driven. But this feels like you're waiting for something that isn't coming. I turned back to the window. When I started this company, I told myself it was about independence, about proving I could build something without my family's shadow. You did that. I did. Somewhere along the way, it became about something else, about being seen and about finally being undeniable. I paused. But they never really saw me. They just reacted when they lost control. Jennifer nodded slowly. So what now? I thought about the years spent preparing for a confrontation I never consciously admitted I was waiting for. I don't know yet, I said. I spent so long defining myself in opposition to them. Now that it's over, I need to figure out who I am without that fight. She smiled faintly. That might be the hardest part. Probably. After she left, I stayed where I was. The city hummed below. Somewhere out there, my father was sitting in silence, facing investigations, consequences, and the collapse of the identity he'd wrapped himself in for decades. My mother was managing the fallout, doing what she always did, smoothing, reframing, and holding things together just enough to survive. Marcus was already adapting. And I was here in an office I owned, looking out at a city that now knew my name. I had won. But victory, I was learning, wasn't an ending. It was a transfer of power, of identity, and of responsibility. The question wasn't whether I'd earned this moment. The question was what kind of life I would build now that no one was standing in my way. 6 months after the IPO, the federal investigation concluded. Richard Whitmore was offered a plea deal, 1 count of securities fraud. He was offered cooperation in exchange for leniency and a reduced sentence if he testified against others involved. It wasn't mercy. It was efficiency, the justice system deciding that information was more valuable than punishment. He took the deal. The coverage was loud for exactly 48 hours, with headlines and expert commentary, followed by a brief resurrection of his name across financial media. Then the world moved on. There were always new scandals, new collapses, and new people to be shocked by. By the time my father entered his guilty plea in a downtown federal courtroom, his fall was already old news. I didn't attend the hearing, but I watched the footage later. He walked up the courthouse steps slowly with his shoulders hunched, his suit hanging loose on a body that had lost weight it couldn't afford to lose. The man who had once filled rooms with certainty now seemed to shrink inside his own clothes. My mother walked beside him, her posture perfect, and her face carefully composed for the cameras. She had always known how to perform stability. Marcus was nowhere in sight. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month. Until then, my father was free on bail, confined to the state, and mostly to his house. He called me the day after the plea. I watched the phone ring once, twice, 3 times 4. Then I answered. Victoria. His voice was steady, but the steadiness felt practiced, like something rehearsed in front of a mirror. I need to see you. Is this about sentencing? No, he said quickly. It's about everything. Please. We met at a restaurant neither of us had ever been to, not his world and not mine. It was neutral territory, with no memories attached. He was already seated when I arrived, a single glass of water sitting untouched in front of him. I took the chair across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Thank you for coming, he said eventually. I almost didn't. He nodded. There was no argument and no deflection, just acceptance. I'm going to prison, he said. 18 months. Maybe less with good behavior. He paused. The lawyers say cooperating could reduce it further. You're going to testify against them. They weren't my friends, he said quietly. They were useful contacts. He looked down at his hands. I'm starting to understand the difference. I didn't respond. Your mother wants a divorce, he continued. 35 years. The moment everything fell apart, she started talking to lawyers. He gave a hollow laugh. I don't blame her. I would do the same. I met his eyes. Is this what you wanted to tell me? No. He straightened slightly. I wanted to ask you for something. I know I have no right to ask. What is it? When I get out, he said, when this is over, I want a chance. He hesitated. Not to work with you and not to profit from what you built. Just a chance to know you. To understand what you became while I wasn't looking. His voice cracked slightly. I spent 60 years thinking I understood success, thinking I knew how the world worked. He swallowed. I was wrong. About all of it. The worst part isn't losing my career. It's knowing I had a daughter who became extraordinary, and I didn't just miss it. I fought it. The silence between us stretched. You're asking me to forgive you, I said. No. He shook his head. I know forgiveness isn't mine to ask for. I'm asking for something smaller, the possibility. Just not closing the door forever. I thought about the villa dinner, the Wellington Club, David Palmer, and the hospital room. Every moment was stacked neatly on top of the next, until we were here. I won't visit you in prison, I said finally. I won't write letters and I won't take calls. While you're serving your sentence, you'll do it without me. He nodded slowly. He had expected this. But after I continued, after if you've actually changed, not just talked about it or performed it, but did the work, then we can talk. No promises and no expectations, just the possibility you asked for. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. That's more than I deserve. Probably, I said, but I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because carrying this forever would cost me more than it costs you, and I've already paid enough. I stood up. Victoria, he said, stopping me. What you built, Vertex, the way you did it. His voice shook. I spent 30 years in business and I never built anything that survived me. You did. I was wrong about you, about everything. I looked at him. Don't become better for me, I said. Do it because without control, without status, and without leverage, you need to know who you are. That's the only thing that matters now. I left him there. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the street. People passed by laughing, arguing, and living. No one noticed the fallen executive sitting alone inside. The chapter with my father wasn't closed, but it wasn't open either. It was suspended between who he had been and who he might become. Some endings aren't clean. Some apologies don't erase the damage. Some relationships don't resolve. They just stop bleeding. I got into my car and drove back to the office. There was always more work to do. My father went to federal prison on a cold morning in January. I watched the footage from my office, a brief news segment, barely 30 seconds long. There were grainy shots of a gray building, a gate opening, and my father stepping out of a car flanked by officers. There were no statements and no drama, just a man disappearing into a system designed to reduce people to numbers and schedules. My mother wasn't there and no family members were. That absence said more than any headline could. He served 14 months of his 18-month sentence. He was granted good behavior and cooperation, the standard math of the justice system, where remorse is measured in compliance and time shaved off a calendar. I didn't contact him once. I didn't respond when Marcus reached out to keep me informed, and I didn't answer my mother's careful, tentative attempts to reopen communication. Every message carried the same unspoken hope that enough time had passed, the worst was over, and we could pretend again. I wasn't interested in pretending. Instead, I focused on what I could control. Vertex Holdings continued to grow. We acquired 2 smaller competitors quietly without the fanfare that had followed the IPO. We expanded into European markets and launched a new product line that exceeded projections so dramatically that even my most conservative board members stopped tempering their optimism. By the time my father was released, our market capitalization had tripled. I made changes in my personal life too. Not dramatic ones or symbolic gestures, but practical changes. I sold the warehouse apartment that had once felt like freedom and bought a house outside the city, something with land trees and silence. It was a place where the noise in my head had room to settle. I started therapy, not because I was broken as I was functional, successful, and disciplined, but because I had learned that functionality wasn't the same as health. I wanted to understand patterns before they repeated themselves. I wanted to know where my instincts came from, which ones served me, and which ones were scars masquerading as strength. I began learning how to trust people who weren't employees, people who didn't have deliverables and couldn't be fired, contracted, or managed. It was slow, awkward, and uncomfortable, but it felt necessary. The day after my father's release, I received a letter, not an email or a text, but a letter. It was handwritten on plain paper with no letterhead and no performance. I read it carefully and then read it again. He didn't ask to see me, didn't ask for forgiveness, and didn't try to justify himself. He wrote about therapy, about prison, and about how stripping away control strips away identity. He wrote about how much time there was to think when there was nothing left to manage or manipulate. "I'm trying," he wrote. "Actually trying." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with other things I wasn't ready to resolve yet. 3 months later, I was in Arizona for a conference. On the final afternoon, I rented a car and drove to the address on the envelope. The apartment complex sat near the edge of town, beige buildings, sparse, landscaping, functional, and anonymous. It was the kind of place you lived when you were starting over or had nowhere else to go. I knocked. He opened the door and froze. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared, as if his mind needed time to catch up to his eyes. "Can I come in?" I asked. The apartment was simple, not bleak, just unadorned. There was a couch, a table, a small television, and books on a shelf that looked worn, not decorative. A laptop was open on the table with an online course pulled up on the screen. "I'm getting a degree," he said, noticing where I was looking. Philosophy. That surprised me more than anything else. I spent my whole life dismissing things that didn't produce immediate value. He continued, "Turns out meaning doesn't work on quarterly timelines." We sat on the couch. Light filtered through blinds that needed cleaning and dust motes hung in the air. "I'm not here to reconcile," I said. "I'm not here to forgive you. I'm here because your letter sounded different, and I wanted to see if that difference was real." "It is," he said simply. "How do I know?" "You don't," he replied. "You can't. Trust isn't something I get to ask for anymore. It's something I have to earn slowly, quietly, without guarantees." He talked about therapy, about volunteering at a shelter, and about listening instead of advising. He talked about how uncomfortable it was to exist without hierarchy or leverage. For the first time, he said, "I'm not trying to be better than anyone. I'm trying to be better than who I was." We talked for an hour, not about the past, not yet, but about ideas and change. We talked about how strange it is to realize late in life that everything you optimized for was the wrong metric. When I left, I didn't promise anything. I didn't outline next steps or future conversations. I just said, "I'm glad you're doing the work." He nodded and said, "That's enough." I drove back to the airport and flew home. That night, I sat in my house and thought about doors, which ones to close, which ones to open, and which ones to leave unlocked without inviting anyone in. My father had spent his life slamming doors on vulnerability, on uncertainty, and on anything he couldn't dominate. And I had spent my life building walls to survive the impact. But walls could become prisons too. I wasn't ready to let him back into my life. Maybe I never would be. But I didn't need to barricade the future either. I could leave the door unlocked. For now, that was enough. 2 years after the villa dinner, I stood on a stage in front of 2,000 people. The room was enormous, with rows of seats stretching farther than I could clearly see under the lights. The audience was made up of founders, investors, and executives, people who built things for a living and understood risk, failure, and ambition. They were the kind of people my father had spent his life trying to impress. I was giving the closing keynote. Behind me, the screen lit up with the title of my talk, "Building Without Permission." I paused for a moment before speaking, letting the noise settle. Conferences have a rhythm, chatter, movement, and anticipation, and it takes a few seconds for a room that large to become quiet. When I started my company, I told everyone I was doing consulting work, freelance projects, small contracts, nothing serious. A few people smiled and some nodded. They'd heard versions of this story before. The truth was, I was building something much bigger. I hid it not because I doubted myself, but because I knew exactly how people would react if they knew what I was really doing. The room stilled. They would question me, criticize me, and suggest safer alternatives. They would ask why I couldn't just be satisfied with something reasonable. They would turn my ambition into something I was expected to justify or apologize for. I let that land. So I built it in secret. For 6 years, I worked quietly while the people closest to me assumed I was failing. When the truth finally came out, not on my terms and not when I was ready, I learned something that changed everything. I stopped speaking. Silence is uncomfortable for many people, and in rooms like this it feels risky. But silence has weight if you let it. I learned that their permission was never required. Their approval was never necessary. The only thing that mattered was the work, the daily decisions, and the unglamorous, repetitive act of building something real when no one is clapping yet. For the next 30 minutes, I talked about the company's strategy and growth. I spoke about mistakes that nearly killed us and the discipline required to recover from them. I talked about scaling culture and why some things are worth doing slowly, even when the market demands speed. At the end, I came back to the personal. "Some of you know my story," I said. The family conflict, the investigation, the estrangement. I won't pretend those things didn't happen or that they didn't hurt. I scanned the room, 2,000 faces, each carrying their own version of pressure, expectation, and history. But I also won't let those things define me. The most important thing I've learned is this: you cannot build a meaningful life while waiting for other people to validate it. You cannot create something extraordinary while worrying about who might feel threatened by your success. I felt my voice steady and grounded. Build anyway, create anyway, succeed anyway. Not to prove anyone wrong, but because this is what you were meant to do. When the people who should have supported you finally understand what you've accomplished, let them deal with that however they need to. It's not your job to manage their feelings. It's your job to keep building. The applause wasn't explosive. It was sustained, deep, and real. Afterward, at the reception, I moved through the room the way I always did, through conversations, introductions, and follow-ups. These were the mechanics of success I had learned to navigate comfortably. But my mind kept drifting back to a phone call I'd made that morning to my father. It had been our first conversation in 6 months. It had been careful and measured, two people aware that words mattered now in a way they hadn't before. "I saw you're giving the keynote," he'd said. "I won't watch. It feels like an intrusion. But I wanted you to know I'm thinking of you. Thank you." There was a pause. I'm proud of you. I know I have no right to say that, but it's true. I know. Another pause, longer this time. Is that enough? He'd asked quietly. For now, is that enough? I had thought about doors, about trust, and about the difference between reconciliation and coexistence. It's enough, I'd said. For now. Standing in the reception hall, I understood what that word really meant. Enough meant my father living simply and doing the work without guarantees. It meant my mother divorced and learning who she was without managing someone else's image. It meant Marcus, who had stopped reaching out once there was nothing left to gain. And it meant me standing in a life I had built deliberately and consciously without asking for permission. The ending I once imagined, total vindication and undeniable triumph, had never been the point. The point was this: I stopped waiting and I stopped explaining. From that point on, I just focused on building. My father had begged for a chance, and I had given him a small one. My family had tried to reclaim control, and I had made sure they couldn't. Life was moving forward. That evening, I flew home to my house outside the city. I poured a glass of wine and sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind land I owned and chose. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. Great speech today. Team dinner tomorrow to celebrate Q3 numbers. I smiled and typed back, count me in. Somewhere my father was reading philosophy and preparing for his volunteer shift. My mother was building a life she'd never allowed herself to imagine. Marcus was doing whatever Marcus did, and I was here building, creating, and moving forward. They had said I would always be looking for work. They were wrong. But in the end, that didn't matter. What mattered was that I knew exactly who I was, and I had chosen this life without asking anyone's permission.